Hi, this is Jeff Helgeson in Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. To demonstrate some of the significance of the book that I'll be doing my best to talk about today, I thought I'd begin by referencing an article from the Chicago Tribune that was published on April the 27th, 1997. Under the headline, "Dramatic Readings Tilt at Classic Adventure, Spaniard's Possible Dream, 27 Hours of Cervantes' Don Quixote Attracts a Cast of Thousands." What's described is a reading arranged to commemorate the anniversary of the date of the author Miguel de Cervantes' death in 1616, reputedly the same day as that of both William Shakespeare's estimated birth and well-documented death 52 years later, April the 23rd. Although the difference at the time between the Spanish Gregorian calendar and the English Julian calendar could mean that Cervantes may have actually died as many as 10 days earlier than his English counterpart. At any rate, as the subtitle to the article states, complete reading of the book required 27 hours. The event, attended by thousands of people, according to the article, enlisted the efforts of politicians and actors and involved a national champion cyclist, as well as young and old readers from throughout all of Spain, along with participants from Portugal and Italy, Germany, and even China. Also included, the report states, was a young blind girl who came with her text in Braille and then ran her fingers over the page and let the words ring out. That, I would say, is quite a testament to the popularity of a 400-year-old book that Gregor Lukács described in Theory of the Novel, historical philosophical essay on the forms of great epic literature, as the first great novel. Of course, there was also the Broadway musical The Man of La Mancha and its 1972 film adaptation featuring Peter O'Toole, Sophia Loren, and James Coco, in addition to a 2011 motion picture titled simply Don Quixote, retelling the story without any singing. Added to that are such things as Elaine Elias' 2018 jazz piano reference to Don Quixote in a release titled To Each His Dulcinea, as well as terms and expressions such as quixotic and tilting at windmills that are as commonly used as the phrase catch-22 by people who have never read the works of either Miguel de Cervantes or Joseph Heller. When considering this writer, Cervantes, not Heller, I think in order to even begin to understand the significance and impact of his work, it's important to take into consideration the historical circumstance of Spain during the time of his life. You see, when Miguel de Cervantes was born near Madrid in 1547 into a converso family, meaning one of Jewish descent that had possibly been forced to convert to Christianity, his Spanish homeland was at the pinnacle of its global power. Just 50 years before, in 1493, Pope Alexander VI, the father of both Caesar and Lucretia Borgia, had divided the newly discovered lands of the infidel along the Atlantic coasts of Africa and the Western Hemisphere between Spain and its maritime rival Portugal. Then, 20 years later, Ponce de Leon had found Florida, although not the Fountain of Youth, and Vasco Núñez Balboa had discovered the Pacific Ocean. I mean, how could you miss it? Even though about 200 years later, the Romantic poet John Keats confused him with Hernando Cortez, who it seems had been busy at the time founding Veracruz, conquering the Aztec Empire, and claiming all of Mexico for the Spanish crown. Then, in the early 1530s, the illiterate Francisco Pizarro, with fewer than 200 conquistadors, had shown a rather dark side of errant knighthood when capturing the Incan ruler Atahualpa and offering to free him in exchange for a room full of gold, but after having received the ransom, killing him anyway, before establishing Lima, the City of Kings, as the Spanish capital of Peru. So much for Chevalier gallantry. Finally, 2 years before Cervantes was born, huge deposits of silver and gold were discovered in what is now Bolivia, and Spain became the richest country in the world, allowing King Philip II to begin building his invincible armada. And then, at the age of 22 in 1571, Miguel de Cervantes participated in the Battle of Lepanto, when the last major Muslim forces confronting Western Europe and the Mediterranean Sea were defeated, making Spain the most preeminent economic and military power in the world. Of course, from a pinnacle of any kind, the only way forward is down. For Cervantes, personally, a fairly significant decline began with 3 gunshot wounds, one of which caused a permanent injury to his left hand suffered during the battle, and causing him to be called the Cripple of Lepanto. As for the nation of Spain itself, there was revolt against its rule in the Netherlands, uncontrolled inflation caused by the huge influx of gold and silver from the New World, and eventually the English defeat of the Invincible Armada in 1588. Medieval-styled naval vessels, as well as chivalric ideas, it seems, had failed. They'd been eroded away by the pragmatic expediency of treachery, defeated by storms at sea and the agility of more maneuverable English ships of the pirateers, and overwhelmed by economic forces which at the time appeared to pass human understanding. At around this same time, as observed by George Lukács, the great epic was replaced by entertainment literature, and as Lukács further states, the chivalrous novel had succumbed to the fate of every epic that wants to maintain and perpetuate a form by purely formal means after the transcendental conditions for its existence have already been condemned by the historical, philosophical dialectic. In other words, things had changed. The epic no longer maintained what Jesse L. Weston, in From Ritual to Romance, characterizes as the ultimate objective of initiation into the secret of life. The printing press had already existed for over 150 years, and as Andrew Milner points out in Literature, Culture, and Society, the new technology had transformed the book trade. For better or worse, the moving finger of time had writ and then moved on. As for Cervantes, the personal adventure following Lepanto came to include being captured and held for ransom as a Christian slave by Algerian pirates for 5 years, unsuccessfully leading several escape attempts, and eventually having his freedom purchased, but then living in poverty after his return to Spain while trying to establish a literary career as a poet and dramatist, as he himself stated, gaining more experience in reverses than in verses. In 1597, while working a day job for the government due to someone else's embezzlement, the would-be writer was briefly imprisoned, and it seems while being held in the Crown Jail of Seville, began to develop the plan for a parody of courtly romances, which has since become the second most translated book in the world, next to the Bible. It wasn't until he was almost 60 years old that in 1605, Miguel de Cervantes experienced the overnight success, which came with the publication of the first part of the delightful history of the most ingenious knight, Don Quixote. It was an immediate bestseller. Several editions were produced, as well as translations into French and English. And then, a decade later, after publishing a collection of short novels, when another writer fraudulently produced a second part of Don Quixote in 1615, the year before his death, Cervantes released his own sequel, including an acknowledgement of the earlier work and its unauthorized second installment, offering the observation in its prologue that one of the greatest temptations of the devil is to put into a man's head that he can write and print a book and gain both money and fame by it. As I see it, the 2-volume, 950-page text celebrated in 1997 was not merely a farcical satire of seemingly outmoded medieval notions, but it was also the result of a broad-based disillusionment regarding the inability of people living their daily lives to achieve those types of high ideals. As A.K. Chelston stated in his 1911 poem, La Pinto, Cervantes on his galley sets the sword back in its sheath and sees across a weary land a struggling road in Spain up which a lean and foolish knight forever rides in vain. The question, for me anyway, is what makes the knight so foolish? Is it his midlife crisis resulting in a skewed sense of reality from having read too many chivalric adventures? Or is it the belief that noble ideas can actually be achieved in the down-to-earth, practical world of day-to-day events? In other words, even though the errant knight clearly mistakes everything he encounters as being the result of various types of enchantment, does falling short of high principles really discredit them? Or even, does aspiring to what should be, in spite of what is, make someone insane? If the answer is yes, then Cervantes is merely making fun of his Man of La Mancha, and the ongoing joke is simply the hyperbolic misinterpretation of things. In that case, however, another answer could well be, why do people identify with him, and in some way even want to believe in his impossible dream? And I suppose it's those questions which a gentle reader must answer for him or herself. Of course, at the beginning of the second section, after some 450 pages, Cervantes does have Quixote say himself, "I am only at pains to convince the world of its error in not reviving that most happy age in which the order of chivalry flourished." For what it's worth, in a far less than 27-hour summary, the story, as it's told, is purported to have been derived from the reliable source of the archives of La Mancha, and then from the translation of an Arabic text. In the narrative, a man who is approaching 50, who Eric Auerbach in Mimesis, a representation of reality in Western literature, describes as the victim of a social order in which he belongs to a class that has no function. Well, he's read too many books about chivalry and the adventures of medieval knights and essentially decides to become one. Pulling together a suit of armor and taking on the name of Don Quixote, he renames an old horse Rocinante and declares a local farm girl to be his beloved, whom he calls Dulcinea del Toboso, dulce meaning sweet in Spanish, and then ventures off to an inn that he perceives to be a castle, addressing the whores he meets there as fair ladies, and having the proprietor dub him a knight, but then quarreling with some mule drivers before moving on and intervening with a man who is beating a servant, and later entering into a quarrel, gaining a sense of awareness. The would-be knight seeks out the farmer who had brought him home, Sancho Panza, whose name means holy belly, a contrast to the tall, thin figure of Don Quixote that has been compared to the carnival of Mardi Gras before the Christian season of Lent, inviting him to be his squire and offering to make him the ruler of a someday to be conquered island for his efforts. After attacking a group of giants, which miraculously become transformed into windmills by an enchanter wizard, this knight of the ill-favored face engages in combat with a pair of friars who are traveling along the same road as a woman in a carriage and are perceived to be enchanters holding her captive. This is where the first narrative ends, the story of the famous adventurer knight, then being resumed within the work of a Moorish writer, Sis Hamnet ben El Ghali. From this point on, there are various encounters with goat herders and Portuguese musketeers with whose mares the noble steed Rocinante attempts to mate, causing the horse, the knight, and his squire to be severely beaten. Again, going to an inn, a servant girl is mistaken for a beautiful princess, leading to a fight with a mule driver and a broken bed, followed by the use of a balm made by Don Quixote himself to help he and his squire recover from their injuries, which of course makes them each sick before the knight leaves the inn without paying. And Sancho is then tossed in the air and caught in a blanket several times by other guests. Eventually escaping and rejoining his master, a barber's brass bowl is taken to be a golden helmet and seized by the knight in fair combat before the freeing of a group of galley slaves in the interweaving of the stories of a series of star-crossed lovers, with Sancho Panza eventually being sent with a message for Dulcinea and returning with the priest and barber from La Mancha in a plan to bring the deluded adventurer knight back home. En route, they meet a woman who had been scorned by her lover and who agrees to help them by pretending to be a princess who is in need of assistance to regain her lost East African kingdom. Back at the inn, Don Quixote engages in a battle with wineskins that he believes to be the giant who has taken the kingdom from the princess. A pair of romantic estrangements are resolved, and a set of long-separated brothers are brought back together before Don Quixote is placed under arrest for having freed the galley slaves and returned in a cage to his home. The second part of the novel, an additional 500-plus pages, published a decade after the first series of adventures, assumes that all of Spain is aware of the first book, and in addition to a hallucinogenic descent into an enchanted cave, primarily deals with a series of practical jokes played upon the famous knight and his squire by a duke and duchess, one of which briefly involves Sancho Panza becoming the governor of an island, and another requiring the squire to flagellate himself 3,300 times in order to release Dulcinea from a magic spell. Following a visit to Barcelona, which ends with Don Quixote being defeated in combat by a young man from his village who appears as the Knight of the White Moon and demands that his opponent retire to become a shepherd. The aging knight returns home, falls ill, and dies in his bed, leaving a will that disinherits his niece, should she ever choose to marry a man who reads books dealing with chivalry. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Next time, it's John Milton and a little bit of John Bunyan justifying the ways of God to man. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois, and is open from noon until 7 o'clock in the evening, Tuesday through Sunday.